So we've come now to the Millennial Reign of Christ. The amillennialist and premillennialist, we'll call this just a description of the church age. I'm still a little baffled at how this can be called the church age. Spent a little time this week dialoguing with an Anglican on this subject in light of this study, and just came to the conclusion I'm just never going to understand how someone summarizes this as the church age. So we're going to deal with this view as the coming reign of Christ. We're not going to deal with a lot of the controversy between amillennialism, premillennialism, and so forth. We'll basically just take it as it is. And so let's begin with Satan's role in the millennium in verses 1 through 3. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short period of time. So here's the shocking thing to me about Revelation 20, and I don't know if I've heard anybody point this out when they were teaching it, so I wanted to draw attention to it today, and that is this passage that we've come upon is the reign of Christ on earth. Last week we saw how amazing it was where Christ came through the clouds. He conquered in the power of his voice. He conquered the armies of the beast. He hurled the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire. And one would expect that following that victory, we would have this description of a time of worship and peace and prosperity, people flocking to Jerusalem, giving homage to the king, the wonders of what the world will be like when it is ruled with Christ himself as the King of Kings. But it turns out we don't have that here in Revelation 20. Instead, the 10 verses that cover this 1,000-year time period, the first 3 verses are on the binding of Satan. The last 4 verses are on the release of Satan and his rebellion. So that means a full 7 out of 10 verses, or 70% of it, are on the bookends of this period with the opposition of Satan, his chaining at the beginning and his rebellion at the end. That's why I went with an image of a chained dragon as my cover image, because I was trying to draw attention to this reality. There are only 3 verses on the kingdom itself, and those verses are limited to not what it'll be like, but who will reign in it. So then the question is, where do we learn about the goodness of the millennial kingdom at all? Well, the goodness of the millennial kingdom isn't here because it was first described in the Old Testament. There are dozens of prophecies related to this time period in the Old Testament. The 3 most famous are Isaiah 35, Ezekiel 36 through 48, which is the longest passage, and then we also have Zechariah 12 through 14, among many others. So when it comes to this time period and wanting to know what this is like from the perspective of God's people in it, I believe John doesn't cover that in Revelation because it's already been covered again and again and again in the Old Testament. So instead of repeating what came before, John is instead just providing us with the information that we didn't see earlier. So if you're a good Berean and want to read more about the millennial kingdom, you can look into those passages where they're described in the Old Testament. So now let's talk about the new information on the kingdom that is provided by John. John's emphasis is clearly on the importance of Satan being bound during this time period, which I think should probably tell us that we don't fully appreciate the impact that the devil, the accuser, the tempter has on our world at this time. I mean, think about it. If the main emphasis of the millennial kingdom from John's perspective is the removal and then the final rebellion of Satan, I don't think we really see fully how much influence the forces of darkness have on the church and the world during this time. I don't believe it would be a surprising to us how messed up the world is if we are more aware of how the devil is impacting, influencing, moving around this world as a lion, devouring people one by one, turning nations against one another. It will have an obvious, tremendous impact on the dragon being changed during this time period. So I think looking at the millennial kingdom should help us to just see a little bit better how much of an influence Satan and his forces have on the world during our time period. So we read here that the dragon will be sealed in the abyss for 1,000 years. Now, that abyss was mentioned earlier in the book of Revelation. It's actually mentioned 3 different times in Revelation. The abyss comes up in Revelation 9, Revelation 11, Revelation 17, and it is the abode of demonic forces that are released from the abyss and then allowed to wreak havoc upon the earth. Now, when we read those passages, what we're really seeing is that we have these demonic beings who were not allowed to influence the earth and then are let loose upon the earth. So what we're seeing is that Satan, in the same way, he will be restricted from being on the earth during the period of the millennial kingdom. In the same way that in the second half of the tribulation, Satan is restricted from being in heaven, during the millennial kingdom, Satan will be restricted from being on earth. Now, the length of time that Satan is restricted from being on earth is said to be 1,000 years. And it says 1,000 years 6 times in this section. This is where we get the title for this time period as the millennial kingdom. The Greek word for 1,000 is the word chilia. And this is why those who believed in a 1,000-year kingdom in the early church history were called chilias. And the group of people who held to that view, it was a view called chiliism. So chilias believed in chiliism, just like premillennialists today believe in premillennialism. And I want to emphasize that chiliist again, as I brought up last week. This is, as far as we know, the original first view of end-time prophecy in the early church were the chiliists, who believed in a future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. And I just want to continue that emphasis again, because a lot of people will say that, premillennialism is a new view, it's not a historical view, when it's actually the oldest view held initially by the chiliists in the church. Now, some people will point to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. So Satan's presence will be restricted from the earth during the kingdom. Sorry, I didn't get that note. And some people will point to 2 Peter 3, 8, and they will say that when they read that, it says, "But do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like 1 day." And they'll take that verse and they'll say, see, when we have 1,000 years, it doesn't really mean 1,000 years, but it just means a long period of times. But if you look closely at 2 Peter 3:8 and compare it to Revelation 20, you see that this is a really sloppy argument. Because what Peter specifically says in 2 Peter 3:8 is that 1 day is like 1,000 years. He doesn't say it is, he says it's like. So he gives us that kind of language, letting us know that Peter is talking about an illustration. He's using symbolic language. That's the use of that has in the Greek. It's telling us this isn't an actual 1,000 years. It's like 1,000 years. And John never says Satan will be chained like 1,000 years. He says it will be chained for 1,000 years. And another note for those who want to say that we should take 1,000 years just as a long period of time, and that is earlier in John, we've already come across multiple passages where John talks about non-literal numbers, where John just simply talks about a really big number. For instance, Revelation chapter 5, verse 11 says, "The number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands." In Revelation 7:9, John wrote, "A great multitude, which no one could count, So he has these words that he uses for a large number that we're not going to give an exact amount for. Notice also the word myriad, especially in 5:11. That word myriad, which also is used in 9:16 to speak of Apollyon's army. The word myriad just means a large, incalculable number. At times, it could possibly be used for 10,000. But the whole point of myriad is that this is a number that's so big, I can't count what it is. So if the millennial kingdom was an indeterminate amount of time, if it was thousands of years, well, John has already in chapter 5, verse 11, used the word that he would use if it was just thousands of years. He would use the word myriad. It is myriads of years. And also there was even a more simple way that he could do that, because John also talked about thousands of thousands. If he just said that Satan was chained for thousands of years, that would also accomplish that period, that type of language of saying that this is thousands of years long. Instead, 6 different times he just simply says that this time is 1,000 years. He uses 1,000 years, which is not the way you speak of a large number, which he's already done multiple times. So one thing I do want to say is that one thing I don't think would be good to do would be super legalistic on 1,000, as in it's got to be exactly 1,000 years. So if the kingdom were to start in the year 2040, that means it's going to go till 3040, and it'll be exactly 1,000 years. If you remember in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, God said this to Abraham: "Know for certain that your strangers, your descendants, will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So we have 400 years of the Israelites being in slavery in a foreign land. Exodus 12, verses 40 to 41, it says, "Know the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord came out of the land of Egypt." So we have 430 years. You could try to make the 400 even by saying maybe they weren't slaves for the first 30 years and then they only became slaves after that. But if you look at the actual chronology and they're becoming a new dynasty in Egypt during that time period, they probably weren't technically slaves at the slave designation probably for at least 100 years after they've been there. So when you get into these, dates as far as how technically long were they slaves, you can get into some arguments about how long they were actually slaves for. But the point of Genesis and then Exodus is that God said they're going to be in that foreign land for 400 years, and they were there for 430 years. If you look at that, you're basically rounding down from 430 to 400. So the millennial kingdom could be 960 years. It could be 1,030 years. We were not going to say exactly what it is, but we're not going to be legalistic because we'd still say, yeah, that is a fulfillment of prophecy. On the other hand, though, if God were to say to Abraham, your descendants will be in Egypt for 1,000 years as slaves, and then they came out after 400 years, what would we say? God clearly got that wrong. Like he was way off on it. But he wasn't way off on it, like he was right on it. And I believe we're going to say the same thing with the millennial reign. And that should tell us, one, that it's not the church age, because we're butting right up against the church age being 2,000 years long. And so you'd say that God got it wrong if the millennial reign pointed to the church age. So what John is talking about here very simply is a future 1,000 years on earth when Satan is not able to have influence upon this earth in any way whatsoever. He's going to be chained back. He's going to be kept from being a negative impact upon the world, and it will be so much better because of it. And then in Revelation 20, verses 4 through 6, we get to see who are the ruling authorities on earth during this time. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God. And those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they came to life, and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. It's funny how different people see different things in different lights. For the church, the whole big controversy is, how long is this time period, and are we living in it right now? Now, when I read these verses, to me, it is just obviously clear that John is communicating this is 1,000 years long. Like, I don't know how many more times he could say it. Like, it's 1,000 years. It's 1,000 years. It's 1,000 years. And I think it's obviously clear that we're not living in it right now because Satan is very active right now. I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to living in a time where Satan is not active in this world. And so it's clear to me that this is a 1,000-year period. It's not right now. For me, the interesting question of the millennial kingdom relates to the first sentence of verse 4. And that is, who is sitting on these thrones? Who is sitting there in a position of judgment? It's interesting because John doesn't tell us directly. The language is clearer in the Greek than it is in English, but the souls of those who have been beheaded, those individuals are a separate group from those that are in the first sentence. So he has these individuals sitting on the throne in the first sentence, and then it's like he turns and then looks at this second group of people who are those who had been beheaded. So in this paragraph that we've read, verses 4 through 6, there are actually three groups that are mentioned. The first group that's mentioned is the ones who are sitting on the throne. The second group that's mentioned is those who went through the tribulation, they faced the horrors of the beast, those who were martyred because they didn't take the mark or worship the beast. That's group number 2. And then group number 3 is the rest of the dead. So how it reads is groups 1 and 2, you have the rulers on the thrones and the martyrs of the tribulation. Those two groups will enjoy the millennial kingdom in their resurrected bodies. And then the rest of the dead will wait to be resurrected until the end of the millennial kingdom. So there's this special blessing then given to those who are part of the first resurrection, because they will both never fear the second death, which is still forthcoming in the prophecy. And then the second reason that they're blessed is because they'll be able to reign as priests of God and Christ for 1,000 years. And that's going to be quite the blessing to be able to reign with Christ during those years. So the middle group out of these three, we know for certain who they are. They are those who came out of the tribulation and didn't take the mark. We know who they are. But the question is then, who reigns with Christ for 1,000 years? And then also, who waits to have the second resurrection at the end of the millennial kingdom? So let's talk first about who's going to reign during this time period. I think the first group that must reign with Christ, absolutely, like no question about it, the first group that's got to be reigning during that time period is the 12 disciples. The 12 disciples have to be set apart as the first people we know. Jesus says to the disciples that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. I set the disciples apart because multiple times in the Gospels, Jesus makes clear, you 12 will have special role in judging on thrones. Like he makes it clear multiple times, the disciples have this special ability to reign during this time period. Second, I think this also in the ruling must include Abraham and all of believing Israel who believed in the promise. So the Old Testament believing Jews or believing Israelites. We need to remember, what's the purpose of the millennial kingdom? The purpose of the millennial kingdom is Jesus ruling as the Jewish Messiah. I mean, the very hall of faith in Hebrews is all about those Israelites and Jews who are looking forward to this kingdom, this reign. So in a real way, the millennial kingdom is all about God fulfilling his promises to all of these believing descendants of Abraham. And you might be like, well, I mean, how are they all going to live in this promised land to Abraham if we take all of the believing Israelites and Jews together and resurrect them and have them all on earth at the same time? Well, if you understand the full borders of Israel, the full borders of Israel, which is the promise that God made to Abraham, which we've never seen happen in history, because the full borders of Abraham's territory are supposed to go to the Euphrates River, to the Nile River, and all of the land in between there, which is a huge area, like massive in comparison to the size of Israel, like all of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, half of Egypt, even goes down to Sudan, like all of that would be included in there. And right now, most of that land is not livable. Most of it is desert. You would never want to be there. Worse weather than we have in New Orleans, like, believe it or not, awful. But it will all be restored. That's another part of the millennial kingdom, is that all of this land promised to Israel that is currently desert, it'll be restored. So the land size thing, easy. And it also makes sense why God would have made this big promise of land to Abraham, but there was never a point in Israel's history where they ever needed that size of a piece of land. There was never a point like where their population was so big that they would need all of this land. Well, in the millennial kingdom, that's the amount of land that they'll need during that time period. So it all goes together, that believing Israel will be the second group of people. They'll be reigning with the disciples as like the 12 over top of all of them. And then I believe the third group who will also be reigning on thrones during that time period is church age believers. This teaching is based primarily on the book of Revelation itself. I think anything that Jesus says about the church reigning during that time period are probably more indirect statements as opposed to direct statements. But we have a few direct statements in the book of Revelation which speak to us ruling and reigning with Christ in his kingdom. One of the most direct ones is Revelation 2:26 and 27, which says, "And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him will I give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessel, as I also have received from my Father." So thanks to the message to the church of Thyatira, they are told that the overcomers are those who will reign with Christ. And if you remember when we talked about the overcomers are not this special class of the most devoted Christians, but we all overcome through faith in Jesus Christ. So the overcomers are given authority over the nations, but I love the balance of this, because Jesus says, "He who overcomes and he who keeps my works until the end." And I think we also, in Jesus' parables, we see this wonderful balance when Jesus has his parables about the landowner, and he gives his rewards to his servants, showing not only that Jesus will give rewards of authority to all of his servants, but it will be differing levels of reward based upon how we served and how we lived in this time period, as if by how we live now, we're preparing ourselves for ruling in that time period. So both he who overcomes and keeps my words until the end really goes well with what Jesus taught in the parables. So we see here that we'll all be given authority to reign over the nations during that time period. And I also want to note that one thing we just read in verse 27 is we read that we're going to rule them with a rod of iron. And then if you remember, when Jesus came back in Revelation 19:15, we just read, "From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that he may strike down the nations, and he will rule with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God Almighty." So Jesus will rule with a rod of iron, but who's going to be the people sort of executing that rod of iron over the nations? It's going to be the overcomers. So we're going to be given thrones and judgments during this time period. But then the question is, who's going to rule in the millennial kingdom? So bringing all of these together. So we'll have, I think, two groups of rulers. We'll have the Israelites who are ruling over the promised land of God. They'll have that area that was promised to them that they'll be dwelling in. I think the 144,000 will probably be the first I'd say non-resurrected people who will end up having children and repopulating that land where they have the saints ruling over them during that time period, and then spread across all the world will continue to have nations. That's one of the things that's brought up, especially in Zechariah's prophecy, that there will still be all of the nations of the globe during that time period, and we will be ruling over them in an authoritative way. And to me, it kind of almost reads as if the people who were martyred during the tribulation period, they're not ruling during this time period. They're not on the thrones. They're that second group. And while maybe they will be ruling, I kind of like the idea that it says that they're not ruling, because I like the idea that those who are martyred during that time period, for them, the 1,000-year period is like a special Sabbath rest, where they don't even need to have that rule and authority. They just get to rest and enjoy that 1,000-year period for all that they went through in the midst of the tribulation. So while nobody wants to go through the tribulation, if you do, you'll get a great reward for having gone through it. But again, I'm just, looking into that. I could be wrong, but that's kind of how I would like to read it, that they get to sort of enjoy that 1,000 years as a rest, while the rest of us who are the church or Israel, we're all ruling during that time period. And so they're a second group. So then the next question is, who are the rest of the dead who did not come to life until the 1,000 years are completed? So the first group is, I think that's obvious, that those who won't be resurrected until the 1,000-year period is over, I think, are those who die during the millennial kingdom will then be raised following the millennial kingdom. So the dead who will rise after the are those who, yeah, that's right. So that's what I wanted to say. So if you were born in the millennial kingdom and then you die during that 1,000-year time period, you will not be resurrected until the end of that 1,000 years. There's going to be two primary resurrections. The second group, which we have not mentioned, and that the Bible is silent on where they will fall. So I'm not sure if they're going to be resurrected and live during the millennial kingdom, or if they'll be in glory and wait to be resurrected till the millennial kingdom is over, because the Bible just doesn't talk about it. But I'm talking about the believers who believed before Abraham. So individuals like, I like to think Adam was a believer. You have Abel, you have Enoch, you have Noah, all those people who found grace in the eyes of God before Abraham. Will they be part of the kingdom? Will they wait to be resurrected until the end? I don't think the Bible answers that. If it is, and somebody's seen something that would answer it, I don't think I've seen it myself. So maybe they'll be resurrected and be part of the kingdom. Maybe they'll wait for the second resurrection. I don't think it says explicitly. But for 1,000 years, we will rule as judges, priests, and kings in the kingdom of Jesus. The kingdom of Jesus will have a multitude of nations, and then the nation of Israel will have Jerusalem as its capital, with Jesus ruling from it. And it is a kingdom that will be led in justice and truth and peace. And on top of that, the world will be renewed, but not fully renewed, because there'll still be death during that time period. I think by the way that it reads, I think the millennial kingdom and the state of the world will be more like the world between the fall and the flood. So what it was like during that time period. I also think some of the bowl judgments might have been re-changing the world, so it would be like it was before the flood. But you'll have these years of bliss and prosperity and peace. And during these years of bliss and prosperity and peace, you will still have men and women who will fall into sin and who will find discontentment in the rule of Christ. And a lot of people read that and they think, how could that be? How could you live in the millennial kingdom and not believe in Jesus? How could you live in that time period and want to rebel against them? Well, I think America is actually a good illustration of how people can live in this time period and have this happen. Over the last 300 years, throughout America's history, 300 plus years, one of the things about America is that our nation has become progressively wealthier, progressively safer, and we live longer. One of the wonderful things about America is that other nations need to worry about wars taking place in the midst of their borders. We don't. No foreign government has invaded our borders since the War of 1812. And our homes are bigger. Our cars are nicer. Our medical treatments have advanced in remarkable ways. But based on surveys that are taken of Americans today, Americans in 2023, and it's gotten shockingly worse since 2020 in ways where 2020 was not that bad, people. It should not have changed us mentally this much as far as most of America. But Americans are more afraid, worried and discontent than probably at any point in all of American history. We are popping antidepressants like they are Pez candies. People find a multitude of ways to be embittered at any society, and we're going to see that happen even in the rule of Jesus. No matter how wonderful and gracious and compassionate and just and righteous and wonderful his kingdom will be, people will be embittered against it. And at the end, Satan will be released, and he will capitalize upon those individuals. Look at verses 7 through 10. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and his false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So basically two things to note about this section. First, it's really brief. Going into details here will probably be in some ways an exercise in futility, because whatever guesses or assumptions we may have of these verses, we're probably going to end up being wrong. So we should just let it say what it's going to say and not try to guess into things that are not present there. The second thing that we need to note is that we are at least 1,000 years from our day today to when all of these events happen now. Not only are we 1,000 years between now and those days, but what's going to happen in the years between us and them is the world will change in ways like it has not before. So there's going to be massive change in the world during this time period. So I think there's a reason for its brevity, and I think it's probably, if they went into details, we probably wouldn't understand a whole lot of it, just because the world will have changed so much. But let's just get out of it what we can. So what we see here is that Satan, the devil, will be released after 1,000 years to deceive the nation once again. And I believe that this passage is the strongest argument against amillennialism and postmillennialism. Not the earlier verses, it's these verses in particular. Because one of those things that both of those views do is that they say Satan's limited to this day. The way that he's bound in the abyss is that Satan no longer has the ability to stop Gentiles from believing the gospel. And during the church age, Satan can still do many things, but he just can't stop people from believing the gospel. He can't stop the gospel from spreading to nation to nation. The problem with that is that in their system, that Satan would then have to be given the ability to stop people from believing the gospel again at the end of this period. But there's actually nothing about that in Revelation 20. Revelation 20 is about Satan taking people who are already in unbelief and then stirring up their unbelief in rebellion against God. So I think it just ruins their view. It's forcing them to have the passage say something that it just clearly does not say, and really twisting the words into something else. What we see here is that Satan has great abilities to deceive. Such abilities that even in the midst of the millennial kingdom, Jesus will deceive not only people individually, but he's going to deceive entire nations. And they're going to form up an army like the sands of the seashore in the opposition to Christ. I think when we see an army like the sand of the seashore, and it could be millions of people, maybe even 1 billion people in the army, we might be like, wow, like how could he have that many people? I mean, in my opinion, the millennial kingdom at the end of it, I mean, maybe the world has 20 billion people on it. That number sounds kind of ridiculous at this time period, but if you look at how much of the world is unpopulated right now, if you can really take advantage of all the natural resources to the best of its ability, I think the world could easily support 20 billion people. And so you could have an army of 500 million people, and that's still a relative minority-sized population. So I have no problem with him getting an army like the sands of the seashore at the end of the millennial reign. The other thing to note is that this army is called Gog and Magog. And I know I'm in the minority view on this, like an extreme minority in the dispensational view, but I'm still going to stand by it. I believe Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is the only other reference to Gog and Magog in the Bible, I believe Ezekiel 38 and 39 is looking toward this battle in Revelation 20. If you want more details of Revelation 20, it's in Ezekiel 38 and 39. The lesson for it online is called The Bad Gog, if you want to read it. But I think the two are the same. And like I said, I don't want to go into all the details because I go into some of the details when I taught Ezekiel 38 and 39, but I think that's the longer look at this battle. The key point, though, is that even though you have armies of men that are like the sand of the seashore, that once they surround Jerusalem and go to oppose it, once again, the battle itself will be nothing. God will send fire down from heaven. It will consume them. And then Satan will become the third resident of the lake of fire. And one thing a lot of people ask at this point is, why did God just chain up Satan for the millennial kingdom? And then why release him at the end? Like, doesn't it seem like such an odd thing? Like I would assume that you'd take Satan and throw him into the lake of fire with the beast and the false prophet at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. Why chain him and then let him go again at the end? And just to be, and I have no idea why he does this. Like, just being frank. This is something that, if I'm honest, I don't even really feel comfortable speculating as to why he would bind Satan and then release him at the end instead of throwing him into the lake of fire earlier. I mean, if we're honest, why doesn't God, pick up Satan like this, as we know he's powerful enough to do, and drop him in the lake of fire in this moment? Like, why does he not do that? I don't know. Those are the type of questions that are in the hands of God, where we just have to say God's timing is better than our timing. But we need to remember that when it comes to the millennial kingdom, what we should anticipate is reigning with Christ for 1,000 glorious years, and in a time period where Satan will have no sway and influence. And it is that time period that I believe that should be the hope and glory of the church and all God's people. That's what we're all looking forward to, is the return of Jesus Christ. There are so many prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, and so relatively few of them were fulfilled at Jesus' first advent. I mean, we have wonderful ones that were fulfilled at his first coming, but we have major sections of prophecy that are still waiting fulfillment, and they're looking forward to this time. And this should continue to be our hope as we look forward to that coming kingdom of Christ.